Well, thank you, David. I made that prediction after I called Andy, and he told me. And then I said, well, it was a private conversation, so I'll write a book about it. So, well, thank you for that kind introduction. You didn't mention that I wrote a book, that I've already written my autobiography, Sex in the Snow, which I published in 1997. And anyway, I'll talk to you about that later at the bar. I've been looking forward to presenting this to you. Mentioned that he had come into Canada incognito in the 1960s to help the Liberal Party days, actually, when Canadians admired a U.S. president more than their own prime minister, the good old days. These days in Canada, of course, it is the Liberals who are a bit squishy on U.S. foreign policy, particularly after Prime Minister Jean Chrétien in March of 2003 declined to join President Bush's coalition of those willing to overthrow the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Fortunately, however, we Canadians are still blessed with visits by pollsters from the United States, such as recently the estimable Frank Luntz, who told an audience of conservatives assembled in Ottawa, and I quote, "Your Liberal government was corrupt. It was disgusting. The way they wasted your hard-earned tax dollars," he went on, "it was a disgrace." Well, as you know, Canadians are a shy, deferential people. Following the footsteps of two Frenchmen, first, of course, the famous Count Alexis de Tocqueville, and more recently Bernard-Henri Lévy, who's a philosopher who has written. Each of these, of course, have had varying methodologies, varying from visiting prisons to visiting pubs to interviewing Sharon Stone. I guess in the latter case, hoping to be mistaken for Michael Douglas. Second edition of American Backlash. So far, actually, I've been treated much more charitably than Mr. Lévy was by Garrison Keillor in the New York Times. I have been ignored until this evening, of course. So welcome to Montreal. Bienvenue à Montréal. This is, of course, the self-confessed coolest city in North America, the home of the comedy festival Juste pour Rire, Just for Laughs, and the Cirque du Soleil, which is a troupe that specializes in performing pornographic gymnastics for Americans in Las Vegas between sets of Quebec's very own diva suprema, Celine Dion, singing the theme from the most recent version of the movie Titanic, the product of yet another Canadian co-conspirator, James Cameron. My gymnastics are less physical, I hope, however, somewhat entertaining. Told to devote 99% of my presentation to methodology. That would be a very short presentation in my case. But this being after cocktail hour, after dinner, after wine, and being in cool Montreal, I'm going to actually turn that on its head and talk a lot about the substance of my work. For those who are interested in the methodology, there are 29 pages of appendices explaining our methodology in the American Backlash book, and for those who want to get a first-hand version, my colleague Dave Jameson will be presenting tomorrow morning. Dave is our chief scientist. So let's get on with the show. Now let's see if I do a good job. All right. What is, or has been, the fastest growing trend in America since 1992? Religiosity, patriotism, fear of terrorism. Of course, I'm setting you up. It's none of the above. The normalization of violence. Do I have any evidence? Well, we have these questions we put before random samples of Canadians 15 and over. And one of the statements to which people are going to agree strongly or somewhat or disagree strongly or somewhat, you understand the Likert scales, is a little violent behavior relieves tension. It's no big thing. So in 1992, we found that 15% of Americans aged 15 and over strongly or somewhat agreed that a little violent behavior is okay. It's no big deal. 1996 was 27%. Year 2000, 31. And in the year 2004, it was up to nearly a third of Americans. I then thought it'd be interesting to see if there were any interesting demographic groups who might have an orientation this way. So we looked at men, young American men aged 15 to 24. And for them, it is 55% think a little violent behavior relieves tension. It's no big deal. It is acceptable to use physical force to get what you want. The important thing is to get what you want. 9, 17, 24, and 23, which is statistically insignificant. And among young men aged 15 to 24, it's 39% who think that to use physical force to get what you want is okay. So that gives you a little hint of kind of as I lift the curtain and look inside. Survey methodology. Well, we at Environics, we do regular public opinion polling as well, asking people what they think about political figures and public policies. This kind of polling, however, goes beyond or deeper, you might say. We're looking here at people's perceptions, their personal values, their motivations, their mindsets. We use a large battery, well over 300 items, to measure well over 100 social trends. And again, the basis of the American Backlash book is surveys fielded in 92, 96, 2000, 2004. Our analysis is based on well over 8,000 interviews. Again, it was spread over those 4 survey periods. Again, given many of your methodologists, you should know that we collected through the Roper Public Affairs field force. Again, it was a self-completion questionnaire. We left with the respondents and went back a few days later and picked them up. And again, about 160 field points, and of course, data is weighted when it comes back by the usual demographic, gender, age, income, region, and race. And again, 375 values items, 4-point Likert scales, 66 demographics, all the other stuff that goes into a big survey like this, media consumption, leisure activities, political orientations, as you'll see, and so on. And again, these values have been developed over 25 or 30 years, initially developed by Kohut, which became Sociovision, Alain de Vaupien in Paris, and actually he was, in the 1970s, an early colleague of Dan Yankelovich. So we're looking at values here that are beyond the moral values, the wedge values that often are talked about in the United States. As you can see here, I go from A to X. I'm looking for a Z. Anybody who suggests a Z that I should, or a Z that I am, will be given a free pass to Disneyland. So you're looking at acceptance of violence, adaptability to complexity, American dream, everybody knows that, log cabin to the White House, rags to riches, American entitlement, enemy and aimlessness. Again, you're familiar with a lot of these contexts. Concern for appearance, everyday ethics, everyday rage, flexible gender identity, heterarchy, joy of consumption, just desserts. You get rich, you deserve it. If you get blown away, you deserve that. Largesse oblige, the American version of noblesse oblige, patriarchy, penchant for risk. I'll be talking about some of these in a bit more detail. Questioning authority, sexual permissiveness, spiritual quest, xenophobia. Oh, here's just desserts. Confidence that in the end, people get what they deserve as a result of decisions they make, both positively and negatively. Here are the items that we use to construct that trend. People get what they are entitled to. People get, again, you're agreeing or disagreeing strongly or somewhat to these statements in the questionnaire. Rewards and punishments are fairly given. People who meet with this misfortune have brought it on themselves. Personal challenge, this is setting difficult goals just to prove to yourself that you can achieve them, whether it's climbing a mountain or losing weight or running around the track or on the treadmill every day. I often do something just to simply to prove to myself that I can do it. When I really want to do something, I almost always do it. Once I start something, I finish the task. We then hand all this stuff over to Dr. Dave. We've got a number of items. We've got to create trends. We create a map. This is not an eye test. Don't go out to your optometrist and say, I've got to get my eyes fixed. It's to give you an idea that it's a very robust map with a lot of trends placed on it. At the top of the map is an orientation to authority, and you can see the kinds of values that are up there correlate with each other: traditional family, religiosity, obedience to authority, propriety, wearing the right clothes at the right time, national pride, work ethic, American dream, American entitlement, patriarchy define the orientation to traditional authority at the top of the map. At the bottom are people who question that traditional authority, more individualistic orientation. They believe they have an equal relationship with youth. They flexible families, you know, Adam and Steve as well as Adam and Eve. Questioning authority, flexible gender identity, sexual permissiveness, penchant for risk. So it's the north-south axis. The east-west axis goes from fulfillment to survival. So we have over here on the fulfillment end, you can see discriminating consumption, holistic health, civic engagement, gender parity, introspection and empathy, looking inside, empathy, what's it like to be somebody else, ecological concern, control, personal control, spontaneity, and creativity. At the survival end, we have brands being important, xenophobia, fatalism, nothing I can really do to alter the direction of my life, sexism, ecological fatalism, nothing we can really do about the planet, it'll heal itself or whatever. Or if we get through in this one, we can move and find another planet. Just desserts, ostentatious consumption, civic apathy, everyday rage, enemy and aimlessness, and acceptance of violence, which I talked about earlier. This gives us 4 quadrants of mental posture, 4 principal quadrants in America. Status and security, again, traditional authority, but a survival orientation, authenticity and responsibility, authority, but with a fulfillment, idealism and autonomy, again, fulfillment, but with a more individualistic orientation, exclusion and intensity, again, individualism, but with a survival of the fittest orientation. Status and security, obedience to traditional Structures and norms, so the values that are in that quadrant highly that correlate with each other. Patriarchy, status recognition, father of the family, president of the company, general in the army. There are people at the bottom. You move up to the top, you get more stars and stripes and people you can order around, more status symbols. Brands are important to these people. Xenophobia, fear of the other, technological anxiety, fear of violence, and American entitlement. These people have icons. There's the man's man, John Wayne. There's straight-shooting Dick Cheney. Fair and balanced Bill O'Reilly. And then there's the girl they love to hate, the junior senator from New York. Authenticity and responsibility. Fairness, responsibility, well-being is the mental posture in this quadrant. They believe in duty, doing your duty to others, family, community, and so on. They're religious. They believe in everyday ethics. If they pick up a wallet, they'll return it to you with the money in. Gender parity, spiritual quest, holistic health, and personal expression. These people also have icons. For them, Jesus Christ is a superstar. Oprah, who comforts the afflicted every day on her show. Ronald Reagan, the Gipper. And who else do I have here? Oh, yes, Shirley MacLaine, celebrating her 500th birthday this year, is also an icon of people in this quadrant. We have then the idealism and autonomy quadrant. Exploration and flexibility is their mental posture, personal control. They question authority. They're globally conscious. They're citizens of the world, flexible families, flexible gender identity. They feel that they have male and female or masculine and feminine personality traits, whether they are men or women, and are flexible in this. And then religion a la carte. These people also have heroes, JFK, the aforementioned, the leader of the opposition in the United States, Michael Moore, and Jon Stewart, whose irony and intelligence balance out Bill O'Reilly's fair and balanced for his audience. And then there is my nomination for the Democratic gubernatorial contender to run against Arnold Schwarzenegger. I think this person would be a slam dunk. I mean, if we're going to go from humans to Arnold Schwarzenegger, would it not be logical to go from Arnie to Lisa? And again, I give all of this gratuitous observation for free. Exclusion and intensity. For those in the lower left quadrant, they seek stimulus, they need jolts and constant attention, civic apathy, ostentatious consumption, penchant for risk, enemy aimlessness, sexism, and everyday rage is the mental posture here. My son's hero, 50 Cent, who was actually allowed into this country some weeks ago, Eminem, and Jerry Springer. Your life may be shit, but there's worse. And then there is Pamela Anderson, who is my favorite Canadian with American content. For our American friends, there are Canadians in the audience who can explain this to you later. So there we are, the quadrants. So that's sort of Environics 010. Now, having sent you all to school, I now am going to give some results. First of all, the context. We started in this in 92. From 92 to 9/11, we are in a period of what we call fooling around. Things are going quite well in America. Just a second here. There we go. But not everyone in that era is having fun. The terrorism we talked about then was of the more domestic variety in America. The party starts to wind down in the late 1990s. And then, September 11th terrorist attacks devastate America. So after 9/11, we're back to basics in a dangerous world. And we're back to basics in America that is more of a winner-take-all America. These are popular images of, again, that more Darwinistic orientation. Dr. Phil doesn't replace Oprah, but certainly adds on to that daytime TV offering where Dr. Phil occasionally has to spank people who have misbehaved. We then look at the social values data in this era. And what I'm showing now are the trends that have either been growing strongly, growing somewhat, declining, or declining strongly. So the first group that are found to be declining strongly from the 1992 to 2004 are traditional family, obedience to authority, religiosity, starting to get some counterintuitive findings in here, I'm sure, national pride, strongly declining, and a sense of duty in our research, 92 to 2004. Also in decline, spiritual quest, personal expression, introspection and empathy, and sensualism in decline. Growing trends, confidence in advertising, ostentatious consumption, and buying on impulse. With the commensurate flipping of the coin, of course, being saving on principle, which is what Mom says to Sis as they're in their SUV driving to the shopping mall for some more power shopping. We must start saving, dear, soon. Also, increasing intuition and impulse, attraction for crowds, pursuit of intensity, and penchant for risk. And then finally, also increasing strongly xenophobia, sexism, ecological fatalism, and acceptance of violence. In 1992, the average American in our research was just inside the upper right-hand quadrant, authenticity, responsibility. By 2004, the average American is just inside the exclusion and intensity quadrant, the average in our samples of 2,000 to 2,500 people. To illustrate then this, another trend in our, just the single item trend, in order to get what I want, I would be prepared to take great risks in my life. Again, realization that it's a competitive place, and in order to get what you want, you have to be a risk taker, rising from 26% in 1992 to 41% in 2004. Men and women in America, equally down the map from authority to individuality, women being more toward the fulfillment end of the second axis, men being more toward the survival end of the second axis. If we look at the strongest values of men and women, we have a very interesting list. For women, introspection and empathy, reverse sexism, that is, women superior to men. They've clearly read the literature. Look good, feel good, fear of violence, sensualism, everyday ethics, flexible gender identity, which comes in useful in the workplace. Meaningful moments, your mom or the kids call up in the middle of a meeting, you take the call. Advertising as stimulus, and time stress, because sometimes it's hard to be a woman with all the things that American women are expected to perform. Of course, my favorite character I refer to in the book is the Annette Bening character in American Beauty, who I thought was equally interesting to her husband. Men, top values, acceptance of violence, patriarchy, traditional gender identity, parochialism, sexual permissiveness, for them, not their spouses, sexism, penchant for risk, enthusiasm for new technology, entrepreneurialism, and American entitlement. Venus and Mars, I think, has already been observed by a previous author. Men and women by age group, 60 plus, 45 to 59, 35 to 44. 25 to 34, and then young men and young women, both found in the exclusion and intensity quadrant. It is interesting then that we're closer when we're young, and then we're closer again with mental posture when we're old. But in our child-rearing years, when we're supposed to be in families, is when we are furthest apart, which of course partly explains why some of these people actually don't have marriages that last a lifetime. Region in America. Some people posit there's really only two regions. There's the South and then everything else. We actually find that there are more regions, that in fact the country that had a motto, E pluribus unum, really has not so far been successful in making everybody into one. Regions are quite distinct, with the bookends being Texarkana, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Arkansas, and New England at the other end. The top 10 values in New England: flexible families, largesse oblige. I can picture a Boston Brahmin family deciding how they're going to give away daddy's fortune to alleviate poverty or world or AIDS or some other worthy cause. Skepticism toward advertising, religion a la carte, rejection of order, ecological concern, rejection of authority, community involvement, and civic engagement. We may have put the Canadian, this could be Canadian data, I'm not sure, but it's and then Texarkana, we have status via home. I think of JR and South Fork. American entitlement, civic apathy. Why did we send in the National Guard when Walmart could have helped us really with cleaning up in New Orleans? Everyday rage, propriety, traditional gender identity, look good, feel good, patriarchy, and celebrating passages like high school graduations or Hispanic, celebrating the 50th birthday of Hispanic, young Hispanic women. Sort of a vision of Europe versus don't mess with Texas. White 60 plus, Hispanic 60 plus, African American 60 plus, young people, whether they're white, black, or Hispanic, are all found in the bottom part of the map, but over in the exclusion and intensity, whatever their racial background is. American teens, in 1992, we found to be just inside the lower right quadrant. Moving into the lower left, the exclusion and intensity in 96. In the year 2000, right really in the middle of that. In the year 2004, headed right into the corner of the survival individuality quadrant, basically a beeline for nihilism, I guess you might, certainly Darwinism. The top 10 values of American teens of all backgrounds: equal relationship with youth, treat youth as adults, penchant for risk, acceptance of violence, upscale consumerism, enthusiasm for consumption, rejection of authority, enemy and aimlessness, sexual permissiveness, just desserts, and pursuit of intensity. American youth, in this portrait, want the American dream now and without the work ethic, apparently. Get rich or die trying. I don't know whether this sounds like anybody any of you have ever met or know. So that's the portrait of social change in the broader community. That's everybody. That's the random sample, to the degree that we're able to get a random sample in any country, including the United States, even with weighting and all that other sort of thing, a random sample of people age 15 and over. But we're also aware that there is a political evolution in America, and this is now what I want to turn my attention to. Historically, and I guess in somewhat cartoon cartoon characterization, we start the political story with the devastation of the Great Depression that brought America to its knees. But it gave rise, of course, in the 30s, what was the choice? Communism or fascism? America turned to FDR for the New Deal. It begins the rise of the progressive era from the late 1930s, and it carries right through the 1950s. In fact, even Montreal played a small part here. This is just a fabulous picture I found in Ken Burns' book on baseball. This, of course, is Jackie Robinson, who Branch Rickey had sent up to Montreal to play with the Montreal Royals, to see, you know, could he do it? Did he have the fortitude to be the first African American in Major League Baseball? And he played here for a while. The progressive era, of course, culminates in the idealism of the 1960s. But the 60s also gave rise to assassinations, violent eruptions in America, setbacks abroad, of course, Vietnam, stagflation at home, led to a crisis of the spirit. I don't know whether Jimmy Carter used those exact words, but in his presidential address late in the 1970s. And from, again, my perspective, engaged Americans came to question the progressive agenda, the state activism. Is this really American? The idealism of the civil rights movement. Was it really leading to things that we wanted? Busing and other such initiatives. Feminism. Environmentalism, at least as it was being brought about. And hedonism. Again, the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the 1960s and 70s. And Americans who began to question the progressive agenda then began to vote for traditional American values, heralded, of course, by the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, Morning in America. Later that decade, the collapse of communism in Europe. After Reagan, the backlash continues against hedonism, whether it's real or fictional. Fictional, such as in the 2004 Super Bowl, where Janet Jackson, thanks to Justin Timberlake, had a costume malfunction. Affirmative action, a reaction against feminism, of course, continuing even after the ERA was defeated after a lack of support in the States in 1982. Growing tolerance in some circles of homosexuality, and a reaction against post-World War II internationalism. So we have culture wars in the 90s at home and abroad. And, oh, this is my big question. This is the one I'm going to take to that island in the Pacific. If I ever just can only take one question. So this is the question that is measuring the orientation to patriarchal authority. Of course, it's the first institution, the family, that all of us meet. It's where our values, of course, are formed, crystallized, typically by the time we're 8, 9, 10, 11. And again, we think it's important what kind of orientation people have to the authority structure. If somebody came from another planet, they say, well, take me to your leaders. Somebody takes a look at the family. Among the things that they would be interested in would be the structure of authority. And of course, the classic statement that comes down to us from Europe, probably, but brought to this continent as well, is the statement that the father of the family must be the master in his own house. So in 1992, we found that 42% of Americans strongly or somewhat believe that the father of the family must be the master in his own house. I remember presenting this in St. Louis, and a gentleman got up and said, Mr. Adams, did you only survey in Texas? I said, no, it was a random sample. From Cape Cod to Sausalito, they're all in there. And he said, well, please, you know, you advertise that 1 in every 20 surveys is wrong. Would you go back in the field? So in 96, we went back, and it was worse. I mean, it was different. I mean, it was going up. It's now 44. It's not statistically significant, so I can't write a book based on that. So I have to go back in the field again in the year 2000. It's now at 49%. and then in 2004 it's 52%. Now, of course, George Lakoff could live off this for several lifetimes. We, of course, have a lot of other things that this correlates with. One of them is the GOP presidential vote, which in 1992 was 37, in 96 it was 41, 48, I guess 48, the other guy got 51, but he lost, but of course America is a democracy, so. And then in or I haven't been at that session yet, so and then in 2004, it's, so there's a correlation here. The impact of the Great Backlash, religion becoming increasingly evangelical and political in America, the American dream and American entitlement resurge, belief in the American dream and the belief in American entitlement resurge. This is, American entitlement is essentially whatever on the planet America needs to live the way it does, that's okay. It's, America's entitled to this. Growing gap between the rich and the poor, growing gap between generations, marginalization of liberal elites, elites. We have them in Canada, sorry. In America, they're idealists, liberal idealists, and deference to authority, a fear, and a new kind of government activism. As Bill Clinton has said, in a climate of insecurity, Americans prefer leadership that's wrong and strong to leadership that's right and weak. Unlikely voters, of course, are 96, 2000, 2004 are in the exclusion and intensity quadrant. Certain voters are found in the authenticity and responsibility quadrant. Both are headed away from fulfillment towards survival, but clearly voters are moving up the map back to traditional values, and the non-voters, the disengaged, are moving into down the map and over more towards Darwinistic values. Republicans from 96 to 04 are moving up the map. Some actually may have gone to the top and are gone over. We're not sure what's on the other side. And Democrats are also moving in this direction toward, again, survival and a bit up the map toward authority. If I had to do the elevator argument, this would probably be in about a 10-story building about Republicans, Democrats, and the disengaged in terms of their mental posture. On religion, Republican mental posture would be one true path to salvation. For the Democrats, it would be a la carte relativism, and for the disengaged, religion would be irrelevant. Family, of course, with the Republican family, father is master. The Democratic family would be equality, flexibility. Someone leads here, someone leads there, kid leads this, mom leads here, dad leads there, and so on. For the disengaged, of course, what family are we talking about? Society, people like me, more and more people wanting to live in places that are known not only demographically but psychographically with people like them. Whereas Democrats actually have an orientation where they want to sample diversity. Eating would be the same, you have the same food every day versus Chinese food, pizza, or in the case of sampling diversity, the ultimate is fusion with the Democrat. For society and the disengaged is the jungle, their society. Propriety for the Republican is dress for success. Democrat casual is authentic. Wasn't wonk casual, the dress code in the White House during the Clinton years. And for the disengaged, of course, it's bling. I mean, if you've got it, you flaunt it. Ecology, well, human entitlement. The planet is here for us humans to exploit as we see fit. For the Democrats, it is the strongest value. It is a secular religion for Democrats, and for the disengaged, it's invisible. America, for a Democrat, is first among equals, as it was from FDR until the late 1980s, early 1990s. Now, of course, It's America is First. And of course, America for the Disengaged is Vice City, which is, of course, Miami and a video game that my son loves to play. The dream trip for a Republican would be a Mediterranean cruise for sure, but it would be best on the USS Abraham Lincoln, where one can safely repair after some power shopping in Rome, Marseille, and other tourist spots. For Democrat, of course, it's ecotourism in Costa Rica, and for the disengaged, it would be crystal meth. So, from the point of view of a guy who does his research sitting up at the CN Tower in Toronto, where he looks down at Boston and New York and Chicago and San Francisco and says, gee, I've seen this for half an hour, I think I'm going to write a book. My conclusion of this is that political conservatism will defeat liberalism so long as social Darwinism is ascendant at home and terrorism is a threat from abroad. America will change only when faced with another catastrophe as devastating as the Great Depression of the 1930s. And in the meantime, Democrats can only win campaigns and advance progressive causes by appealing to conservative values. Is it the same elsewhere? Well, here's back to my father as master. U.S. in the year, this is 2045 numbers from a number of countries, U.S. 52, Macho Mexico is 43, the Latin peoples of Italy, Spain, France are down there in the high 20s, as is the UK. The Soviet Kazakhstan, or no, Canada is 18, Germany 18, and Sweden 10. Canada, again, comes second. Canada always comes second. You've heard about the Canadian who won gold at the Olympics and was so happy that he had it bronzed. We do take understatement sometimes too far. You saw the evolution in the United States on the map. The Canadian evolution is also down the map, but is, so it's in one sense, both moving away from authority toward individuality, and one moving more toward a survival orientation, the other one more toward fulfillment. If we look at teenagers, who are maybe the canaries in the mine of each of our cultures, I showed you, of course, the direction of social change for American teens, and this was a hypothesis where those of us who are parents of Canadian kids, who see them worshiping J-Lo and Jay-Z and the Get Rich or Die Trying guy, right, and all the others, you know, worship and watch The Simpsons and Family Guy and all the other shows and so on. You think, okay, like if anybody's mentality is, it's going to be our teenagers. But in fact, the Canadian teens are also moving down the map, as again we've seen in the U.S., but are not as likely as American teens to be found in that exclusion and intensity quadrant, but rather in the autonomy quadrant. So we're going to end here with a little, this is Montreal, we're going to end with a little sex and violence. So we'll start with a little violence. This is to kind of illustrate some Canada-U.S. differences. This is, again, violence is part of life, it's no big deal, and 9% of Canadians agree with that, 20% of Americans. We then look at teenagers in each culture, Canadians 15 to 19, and Americans 15 to 19. The Canadians are at 20 teens, so our Canadian teens are at the same orientation to violence as are the average American age 15 and over, and then American teens 15 to 19 are at 36%. And then we look at a little bit of, now this is interesting, this an extramarital affair from time to time is not that serious. Now you would probably think, okay, now these trends that he's been showing us, he's got the overall culture going this way, he's got a political reaction going up there, and then we've got these Canadians who, you know, are tolerating same-sex marriage and so on. I actually went on a Bill O'Reilly show. I was at Cape Cod, and they sent down a crew from the Fair and Balanced Network, the Fox News, and this was 2 or 3 years ago, and they wanted to interview me about the same-sex marriage stuff they'd heard about coming from Canada. And And I assured the audience that Canadians, yes, they were working in this direction, but they would still allow opposite-sex unions. And I did this because I was concerned about the tourist trade in Niagara Falls. Anyway, so extramarital affair. So all Canadians and all Americans on having an extramarital affair. So all Canadians are 10 and Americans are 22. So this is the socially liberal Canadians who don't agree that an extramarital affair is a good thing, versus 22% in the U.S. Canadian teens are actually the same, teenagers at the same level as the average American, and then Americans 15 to 19 are 38%. So now I know I'm speaking to an audience as a few Americans here. I know many of you are here without spouses. But I want you to know that what happens in Montreal stays in Montreal. Thank you.
Well, how do you follow that up? I don't know about you, but I'm ready to move. Here we have a Canadian telling us about, can you hear me, by the way? Canadian telling us about the problems with Americans. Michael is a very good guy, and as a consequence, he started by owning up to his cheekiness. But I have to tell you, we're feeling a bit beleaguered these days. We did a poll last year, and we asked people in, I think, about 18 or 19 countries, are we well regarded? And only 20% in other countries, only 20% of Americans said yes. The second lowest of this group of countries, only the Turks gave a lower percentage, 12%. And guess where the Canadians were? Top of the list. 92% of the Canadians, Michael said, were well regarded. You know, we hear a presentation like this, and it only fuels our feelings of inferiority. My gosh, what a way to start. I mean, what a way to start the AAPOR conference with this analysis of problems with Americans. Our kids are rotten. We also did also in the same poll, it kind of reflects what Michael is saying. We found that the top negative characteristics associated with the American people, not the United States, the people, rude, immoral, and inviolate. Which country was most likely to give those descriptions in the West? The Canadians. I don't know, Michael. Boy, oh boy, why are we here? The one thing, though, that I do remember from the presentations that you've made is that you've described Canada as the little brother, isn't that right? Little sister. That's good. And we can forgive the little brother quite a bit, and so I think that we can excuse your giving us a really hard time as we open this conference. But in all seriousness, I want to say that there are a number of things about this book, and I'm reacting more to the book than this presentation because there's some things that I had never seen before in this presentation. There's some very good things about this book. First of all, it focuses on non-voters, and we don't spend a lot of time in public polls talking about non-voters, and I think Michael does a nice job of telling us something about who they are. Secondly, he looks at voters on the basis, as you've seen, on the basis of psychological characteristics. Most of what the public polls do in the States is look at social, economic, and political values. So I think that there's really something here. He also makes the case, and he didn't describe this in his presentation, that neither side in America, the Republicans or the Democrats, is winning the cultural war. I agree with that, but I think for different reasons than Michael believes that. He also says that Republicans and Democrats hold similar values on many things, or on some things. I'm glad to hear him say that because there's not enough said about the way in which Republicans and Democrats are similar. perhaps because there are damn few ways these days. But in any event, those are some of the positive things I saw in the book and in his analyses. And I'll come back to what I think about the psychological trends that he points to. But I have some significant problems with the political analysis that he does. He writes, when compared with the values of non-voters, Republicans and Democrats are virtually identical. I think that's true in some cases, in a few cases. But there are an awful lot of cases where increasingly Republicans and Democrats aren't similar at all. In fact, the gaps are so much wider. He says that the country is becoming less traditional and less moral, but voters are becoming more traditional, which was shown in one of those trends. And then goes on to assert that voters are becoming more conservative as a counterweight to that one, voters going in one direction in terms of values and the society at large going in another direction. I don't have any evidence of that, and I don't see any real evidence of that in the data. I think there is some backlash to the increasing coarseness of American society, but I don't see any signs in the surveys that we do and others do of a more conservative American society. In some ways, American society compared to the early 90s or late 1980s is more liberal, certainly more liberal with respect to homosexuality, with respect to women's roles. The one thing that really surprised me was that question about the man has to be the head of the family. I've never seen anything quite like that. But there's a whole range of things in which people have become more liberal with respect to the death penalty, more liberal with respect to stem cell research, end-of-life decisions. Yes, and also more conservative with respect to views about the efficacy of government, the efficiency of government solutions, also some increased support for restrictions on abortion. And there's a great bulk of values that we've been tracking and others have tracked which say no change. So the notion that Americans have become more conservative in response to these trends, I just don't buy that. Secondly, the notion that American voters are gravitating to conservative candidates or Republican candidates as a consequence of this doesn't work for me either. President Bush did not win the popular vote in the first election, and he did win the popular vote in the second election in 2004, but he didn't win it on an ideological basis. In fact, his gains were greatest among people who were less conservative, not more conservative, seculars, moderates, and people like that. So there was certainly, I don't see this conservative trend that's asserted as a consequence of these psychological qualities. I think another thing about this book, which is telling the untold political story, is it doesn't reference the increasing differences between Republicans and Democrats on a whole range of values. And it's real and it's significant. The polarization is not baloney. You can measure it, you can see it. We've been detailing the ways in which Republicans and Democrats are indeed going in different directions. They not only go different directions in terms of policies and values, they now have their own separate accounts of what reality is. Look at the way Republicans and Democrats contrast conditions in Iraq. Look at the way they judge the economy. Third, in the analysis, by lumping together all those who said, and this is the premise of the book, lumping together all those who said they were going to vote either Republican or Democrat in 2004, and contrasting that with people who said they were unlikely to vote, Michael misses the middle of the electorate because there is a big difference in the values of core Republicans, core Democrats, and swing voters. Now, swing voters are out of fashion, and independents and swing voters are out of fashion, and that really is the untold value stories. There's been such a value stories. There's been such an emphasis in the States on going to the base and what the base is like. And in the end, what has been ignored is what has been the nature of the independent vote, which has been consistently understated and certainly not explored in the depth that core Republicans have been and core Democrats as well.
I think that is an important omission in an analysis of the untold story of values. Coming back to the notion that Republicans and Democrats are more similar than different than when compared to non-voters, which is a significant part of this book, I think Michael loses sight of the fact that there are huge age and income gaps between voters and non-voters. So it's not surprising that non-voters compared to voters are going to be less civically engaged, have less of a have less commitment to social organization, less individualism. They're younger, they're poorer, and they're less well educated. The final problem in the analysis, and I hate to dwell on the problems, but I've been looking at this from a political sense, is that comparing Republicans and Democrats to people not likely to vote misses the point that the not likely to vote category, which is just one line in this analysis, involves a lot of different kinds of people.